When the German army marched into the Soviet Union in 1941, their confidence was unshakable. They had conquered France in just 6 weeks, crushed Poland in days, and swept through Europe like an unstoppable storm. To Hitler and his generals, the Soviet Union was supposed to be their final grand prize, a land rich in resources, oil, and territory. But what awaited them on the banks of the Volga River was something no soldier had ever imagined. The city of Stalingrad was not just another strategic objective. It was personal. Named after Joseph Stalin, it carried immense symbolic weight. To Hitler, taking Stalingrad meant humiliating his greatest rival. To Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. The result was a battle that turned the city into a graveyard and left German soldiers scarred for life. By the summer of 1942, German troops began advancing towards Stalingrad with determination. At first, the soldiers felt confident. Many wrote letters home, describing how victory was near and how the Soviet Union was already collapsing. But as they reached the outskirts of the city, their optimism began to fade. Stalingrad wasn't just a city, it was a fortress of ruins. Bombed heavily by the Luftwaffe, it became a wasteland of shattered buildings, burning factories, and endless smoke. Yet, within those ruins, the Soviet defenders waited like shadows. German soldiers stepped into a nightmare where every street, every wall, and every basement could hide an enemy ready to strike. One German officer later recalled, "We did not fight for streets or houses. We fought for every floor, every stairwell, every single room." Unlike the wide-open fields of France or Poland, Stalingrad trapped the Germans. Tanks could barely move through the rubble. Artillery had limited effect because the Soviets were dug in among collapsed factories and underground tunnels. What followed was a brutal form of warfare the Germans had never experienced before: close-quarter combat. Soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Entire battles were fought inside apartment blocks, with Germans holding one floor and Soviets holding the next. Grenades, knives, flamethrowers, and bayonets became more common than rifles. Every hour brought screams, explosions, and the smell of burning flesh. For German soldiers, the psychological toll was devastating. They were trained for rapid, mobile warfare. But here, speed meant nothing. Instead, they fought inch by inch, losing comrades every day with no clear sense of progress. As autumn gave way to winter, another enemy arrived: the Russian cold. German soldiers were not equipped for temperatures that fell below -30 degrees Celsius. Their summer uniforms offered no protection. Their boots froze, and frostbite spread through the ranks. Men woke up with their rifles frozen solid, unable to fire. Others lost fingers, ears, and noses to the biting frost. The once mighty Wehrmacht now looked like a broken army, starving, freezing, and surrounded by death. Letters from soldiers that survived tell the story of this nightmare. One wrote, "Everywhere there are corpses, and the snow is red with blood. The rats feed on the dead, and we are so hungry, some men have considered doing the same." A city of shadows. The longer they stayed, the more the city seemed cursed. Shadows of Soviet snipers haunted every street corner. One of the most feared was Vasily Zaitsev, a legendary Soviet marksman who picked off German soldiers one by one, making them feel hunted in a city they thought they had conquered. German morale began to collapse. Some soldiers admitted in diaries that they prayed for wounds, not to survive, but just to be sent away from the horror. Others confessed that they had stopped caring whether they lived or died. Stalingrad was no longer a battle. It was a trap, a nightmare, and a grave. And as winter deepened, the German Sixth Army found itself encircled by Soviet forces, with no way out. By late November 1942, the nightmare had reached its peak. The German Sixth Army, once over 300,000 strong, now found itself trapped inside the ruins of Stalingrad. The Soviet Red Army had launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled the Germans completely. The hunters had become the hunted. Encirclement. The Iron Ring closes. When Soviet tanks cut off the last supply routes, the German soldiers realized they were prisoners inside the city. Hitler had promised that relief would come, that the Luftwaffe would drop enough supplies from the air. But reality was cruel. The planes barely delivered a fraction of what was needed. Soldiers needed 700 tons of food and ammunition every day, yet often less than 100 tons arrived. The rations shrank until men were given only a few slices of bread a day. Horses were slaughtered for meat, then even dogs and cats disappeared. Soldiers boiled leather belts and old boots to survive. One diary entry from a German private read, "We are no longer soldiers. We are skeletons with rifles." As hunger consumed them, discipline began to break down. Men fought over scraps of food. Some looted the belongings of dead comrades. Others collapsed in the snow and never rose again. Commanders ordered their men to keep fighting, but the soldiers could barely walk. Their frozen bodies shook violently from fever and malnutrition. Lice spread through the trenches, carrying disease. The once proud German army was rotting from the inside. Even the most hardened veterans wrote letters home that revealed their despair. One soldier confessed, "Mother, I will never see you again. The city is hell itself, and the devil is taking us one by one." The Soviets pressed forward without mercy. For them, this was not just a battle. It was vengeance for the millions of lives lost to the German invasion. Soviet artillery pounded German positions day and night. Snipers hunted soldiers who dared to move in daylight. Soviet propaganda blared from loudspeakers. "Germans, surrender! You cannot escape Stalingrad. Your Führer has abandoned you." Some German units tried to hold their ground, but the Soviets attacked with waves of infantry supported by tanks. The ruins of Stalingrad shook constantly with explosions, filling the air with black smoke and the cries of the dying. For the Germans, every street became a death trap. Every destroyed factory or burned-out apartment block became a tomb. Inside makeshift field hospitals, the scenes were beyond imagination. Thousands of wounded men lay without proper medical care. Supplies of medicine had run out. Surgeons amputated limbs with rusty saws, often without anesthesia. The screams echoed through the night. Many soldiers begged doctors not to operate, choosing death over the agony of crude surgery. Others were simply left to die in the cold, their bodies stacked like wood outside ruined buildings. One survivor wrote years later, "The worst sound was not the artillery, not the guns, but the moaning of men who knew they were being left to die." As December deepened, temperatures dropped even further. Soldiers huddled together in burned-out basements, wrapping themselves in rags and torn blankets. They burned furniture, books, even pieces of their own equipment just to stay alive for another night. Frostbite claimed thousands. Fingers, toes, and ears turned black and fell away. Some men tied rags around their hands to hold their rifles, though they could barely pull the trigger. The endless white snow was stained with blood, and the icy winds carried the smell of death. Stalingrad had become less a battlefield and more a frozen graveyard. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler refused to accept reality. He ordered the Sixth Army to fight to the last man, declaring that surrender was forbidden. German generals inside the city begged for permission to retreat, to save at least part of their forces. But Hitler's pride would not allow it. To him, retreat was dishonor. To his soldiers, it meant slow death. Caught between Soviet fire and Hitler's orders, the German soldiers realized they were truly doomed. By Christmas 1942, The Germans knew the truth. There would be no rescue. Relief forces attempted to break the Soviet encirclement, but they failed. That Christmas, instead of warmth and family, the soldiers sat in the snow, gnawing on frozen bread crusts, listening to the distant thunder of Soviet artillery. Some wept openly, others prayed, and many simply stared blankly into the fire, their minds broken. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a clash of armies. It was the destruction of an entire generation of soldiers. And as January 1943 approached, the nightmare would only grow worse. By January 1943, Stalingrad had turned into a world of shadows, hunger, and despair. The German Sixth Army, once considered invincible, was now a broken force barely clinging to survival. Inside the shrinking pocket of German-controlled territory, chaos spread. Units that once fought with precision now fought simply to exist. Entire companies were reduced to a handful of starving men. Soldiers wandered aimlessly, their eyes hollow, their uniforms in rags. Some carried rifles without ammunition, others carried nothing at all. They were no longer an army, but a mass of frozen, starving souls awaiting their fate. The Soviets continued to close in, cutting the pocket smaller each day. For the Germans inside, the city was shrinking, suffocating them like a tightening noose. By now, the dead far outnumbered the living. The streets of Stalingrad were littered with frozen corpses, their faces twisted in agony. Soldiers used bodies as makeshift barricades against Soviet fire. One survivor recalled, "We lived among the dead. They were in the streets, in the trenches, in the buildings. Sometimes you spoke to a comrade only to realize he was no longer alive." The stench of rot mixed with smoke and gunpowder clung to the air. But in the freezing cold, the dead did not decompose quickly. They simply froze, silent reminders of what awaited everyone else. The hunger became unbearable. Officially, it was forbidden, but whispers spread of soldiers resorting to cannibalism. In the darkest corners of basements, starving men cut flesh from the dead to stay alive one more day. Not everyone fell that low, but everyone knew the rumors. And in those final weeks, trust among comrades withered. Men feared leaving their bodies unattended, even after death. Such horrors were never spoken of openly, but they lingered in the memories of those who survived. The Red Army, sensing victory, began dropping leaflets from planes. These leaflets promised mercy for those who surrendered and condemned the cruelty of Hitler, who had abandoned his men. Some Germans considered it. Others tore the leaflets apart, afraid of being shot by their own officers if caught. But in secret, many prayed that surrender would come quickly, that someone would end their suffering. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, sat in his headquarters deep inside the ruined city. Once a proud officer, he now looked pale and broken, his hands trembling from exhaustion and hopelessness. Hitler had promoted him to field marshal with a cruel message. No German field marshal has ever surrendered. It was a clear order. Paulus was expected to die in Stalingrad, not to give up. But Paulus saw the truth. His army was finished. The men could no longer fight, no longer survive. Yet still, he hesitated, torn between loyalty to Hitler and responsibility for his men. In late January, the Soviets launched their final assault. Waves of infantry and tanks pushed into the last German positions. Artillery shattered buildings already reduced to rubble. The Germans could not resist. They fired what little ammunition they had left, but many rifles were empty. Soldiers threw stones at tanks, a desperate act that only highlighted their helplessness. The Soviets advanced street by street, block by block, crushing what remained of German resistance. By this point, many German soldiers no longer fought at all. They huddled in basements, waiting for capture. Some burned their uniforms and tried to disguise themselves as civilians. Others tore the insignias from their coats, ashamed of the army they once served. A German sergeant wrote in his final note, "We have no more courage, no more hope, only silence remains." The mighty Wehrmacht that had once swept across Europe was now silent indeed, trapped in a frozen city that devoured armies. On January 31, 1943, Soviet troops finally reached Paulus's headquarters. The German commander, pale and exhausted, surrendered without ceremony. In the north of the city, fighting continued for 2 more days until all resistance ended. By February 2, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. What remained of the Sixth Army, 91,000 starving, freezing men, were marched into captivity. Behind them lay more than 150,000 dead comrades frozen in the ruins. For those captured, the nightmare was far from over. Few would ever return from Soviet prison camps. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, less than 6,000 lived to see Germany again. For the rest, the march into captivity was the final journey. Starved, beaten, and exposed to the cold, they fell one by one in the snow, their bodies left behind on the endless road east. Those who survived carried scars that would never heal. They remembered the screams in the cellars, the smell of death in the streets, the silence of comrades frozen in the snow. The German soldiers who saw Stalingrad were never the same again. The guns finally fell silent in February 1943. The once mighty German Sixth Army no longer existed. The battle was over, but for the soldiers who had endured Stalingrad, the nightmare had only just begun. The Soviets rounded up tens of thousands of survivors, hollow-eyed, starving men who stumbled forward on trembling legs. They were marched eastward, away from the ruins of Stalingrad and into the frozen wastelands of Russia. For many, the march was a death sentence. With little food and almost no shelter, men collapsed in the snow and never rose again. Guards prodded them forward, but when they fell, they were left where they lay. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had marched triumphantly across Europe, was now reduced to broken columns of defeated men. Out of the 91,000 German soldiers captured, only about 6,000 would ever return home. Many years later, after enduring brutal Soviet prison camps. Among the ruins of Stalingrad, Soviet troops found countless letters written by German soldiers but never delivered. These letters revealed the raw desperation of the men inside. One wrote, "Dearest Anna, I am cold and starving. I don't think I will see you again. Remember me." These letters were never read by their loved ones at the time. Instead, they became part of history, voices from the grave speaking across decades. Those who survived captivity and eventually returned to Germany were not the same men who had marched into Russia. Their bodies were scarred by hunger and disease, but the deeper scars were invisible. They were haunted by visions of frozen comrades, of endless bombardments, of the cries of the wounded left behind. Some awoke screaming in the night, reliving the nightmare again and again. For the rest of their lives, Stalingrad was not a memory. It was a wound that never closed. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was the moment when the tide of the entire war shifted. Until then, Nazi Germany had seemed unstoppable. But after Stalingrad, the myth of invincibility was shattered. Hitler had gambled everything on conquering the Soviet Union, and at Stalingrad he lost. From that moment forward, the German army was on the defensive, retreating step by step until Berlin itself fell in 1945. The world remembers Stalingrad not only as a military defeat, but as a symbol of the arrogance of power and the terrible cost paid by ordinary soldiers. Decades later, veterans who survived spoke cautiously of their time in Stalingrad. Some broke down in tears when describing it. Others refused to speak at all. One survivor admitted, "We saw hell with our own eyes. No man should ever see what we saw." Another said, "We did not fight for victory. In the end, we fought only to die with some dignity." For many, Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was a place where humanity itself was lost. Today, Stalingrad, now Volgograd, still bears the scars of that terrible winter. Monuments and memorials stand where entire divisions once fought and died. The ruins are gone, but the memory lingers in the soil, in the river, in the silence of the streets. For the German soldiers who walked those ruins, Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was a haunting that followed them forever. War is often told through strategies, generals, and victories. But the truth of Stalingrad is found in the suffering of the ordinary soldier. The young man who froze in the snow, the father who starved in a cellar, the friend who never returned home. For the Germans, Stalingrad was more than a military disaster. It was a descent into the abyss, a reminder that war does not just destroy armies. It destroys the very souls of those who fight it. And so, what German soldiers saw in Stalingrad truly haunted them forever. The starving faces, the endless winter, the frozen corpses, and the cries of the dying, these images never left them. The city became their grave, their prison, and their ghost. Even for those who survived, Stalingrad was not left behind. It lived on inside them, as a nightmare that could never be escaped. Because in Stalingrad, death was everywhere, and for those who saw it, death never stopped following them.